Good afternoon. My today's guest is Dr. Bob Kayseas, Vice President Academic of First Nations University of Canada and Interim President. First, I would like to thank you, Bob, I know that September is a crazy month for any university, and specifically now when we're all moving to remote teaching. But I really appreciate you found time for our meeting. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Arzu.
Thank you. At the beginning, normally I introduce my guest, and I found some information from the internet and some pictures, and then you can correct me if I make any mistake. So I will now share my screen and bring that file. Okay. Dr. Bob Kayseas is the Vice President, Academic and Interim President of the First Nations University of Canada. He has held many positions during his more than 19 years at this university. Dr. Kayseas is a Saskatchewan-born Anishinaabe schooler. He obtained a degree in business administration and a Master of Business Administration from the University of Regina and PhD degree in enterprise and innovation from the Australian Graduate School of Entrepreneurship, Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Kayseas has established a recognized scholarly program of research center on Indigenous entrepreneurship and economic development. He remains actively engaged in both the research and practice of entrepreneurship and economic development. Most recently, he has worked to foster the integration of reconciliation into academic programming, both in the classroom and in online distance learning. Dr. Kayseas is passionate about creating opportunities both in the classroom and within communities for Indigenous students to grow and thrive. But this is an informal discussion. I want to introduce Dr. Kayseas as he introduced himself on his Twitter page. I don't even know if I'm allowed. Bob introduced himself as a professor of entrepreneurship, consultant, husband, father, grandfather, and Anishinaabe. I like this introducing better than mine. But yeah, although that's the informal, but it's very honest. Now, I will have some questions. Actually, the reason of this discussion, mostly it's just the purpose of learning. So mostly I want to ask you about the questions that I would like to find answers. And I know that I've heard from many academics and even from my students. At least last decades, I would say I can observe that in Canadian people in society, I see more and more interest to Indigenous art, traditions, Indigenous medicines. But there is one area that people don't know much, but still want to learn. That is the Indigenous administration, way of Indigenous administration, business. And you are a scholar who is knowledge about Indigenous and non-Indigenous, about both of way of administration and business making. So that's why I thought you would be the best person to ask about that. But I want to start kind of like historically from history. Could you please talk about the pre-settlement governance, business administration system in Indigenous communities?
You know, years ago when I did the PhD, I actually looked and tried to find evidence of, of uh, economic activities, entrepreneurial activities within the Indigenous communities, and I actually was able to find it in many, many historical records. There was, an example of that was in kind of Western Ontario, Eastern Manitoba. Settlers came west into trying to, find new places to live, to expand, and there was a number of communities that actually required them to pay them for passage through their area, but also to actually sell them different types of wares that they had, right? So that they would need, food, whether they be food and other types of things. So they were, they seen an opportunity, took advantage of it, right? So I think that in many, many ways, there is a great deal of evidence of our ancestors interacting with others through economic exchange, right? So it wasn't money. It wasn't money, but it was for goods often, right? So there was a bartering economy way back in the day, and there was things that were created so that there was items that they would create so that they could transact. So there's lots of evidence of that, of us being, entrepreneurial and really innovative. There's, some of the ways that some of the things that were created by our ancestors just to survive, and living in, especially in some of our really colder climates, were really incredible, right? So I've read stories about the Dene and some of the things that they took from caribou, from wild animals, and how they created these real, being able to boil water, right? Being able to do all the things that we find very easy today was not so easy back then. But they survived in the very, very harsh climates of Canada for many, many years, right? So and they did that because of the innovation that they incorporated into their life, but also being able to actually trade for goods that they didn't necessarily have within their communities. And so I believe that our people have been entrepreneurial, innovative for ever since we've been around.
Yeah, thank you. So now coming our days, uh, you know, I was honored to be invited to some discussions in Indigenous communities about the strategic plan development, and I see uh, they have a very strong business agenda, administration, and again, that's not my area. Um, what can you tell about the perspectives of cooperation of our days, cooperation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous way of administration, business? Can those two systems cooperate?
Yeah, the challenge occurs for today in contemporary times is that when you look at our societies in our communities, we are just for the it wasn't too long ago where it was illegal for us to actually engage in economic activity, right? So if you look at the Indian Act, there's still a provision within the Indian Act that actually makes it illegal for anybody uh, on a reserve in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta to sell what they grow, what they produce off the reserve, right? So that was that, and it's still in the Indian Act. It's not enforced in any way, and our communities were interrupted from, being able to evolve. I mentioned previously that that we were involved in economic exchanges or way back in the day. If we were actually allowed to evolve our economies in the natural way that economies evolve, right, through the industrial, and that type of thing, we would be in a very, very different place. But unfortunately, there was the cultural genocide that occurred in Canada for decades, for over 100 years resulted in a situation where you have many Indigenous communities just trying to find ways to engage in economic activity just in the last 30 years, right? So we're trying, and even within the legislative systems that still prohibit a lot of different action to occur. So we're still trying to find that way. And in terms of cooperation with non-Indigenous, there's still a lot of different challenges that exist. Sometimes Indigenous communities, entrepreneurs engage with industry because industry is seeking to have, access to resources, and the only way that they can gain access is to have an Indigenous partner. Sometimes those partnerships are not very good. Sometimes they don't work out very well. There's a really, really great power imbalance. So, I think that there's going to be a lot of years of actually working towards this cooperation still. And in some situations, there's probably great cooperation, right? And others that there's still this trying to figure out a way to work together, right? So there's still lots of misunderstanding about First Nations people. There's not a lot of knowledge that exists in many different areas of Canadian society, and so sometimes the engagement isn't as beneficial to First Nations as you would want.
Yeah. My native country also was colonized and by Russia about 200 years ago, but then it's an independent country. And I remember in school, we learned about our own history. I remember even our textbook, it was maybe about 100 pages. But maybe 10, 15 times more time we were spending studying history of Russia, European countries. And at the end, it's shameful, but even now I know about my own history, much less than about European history and everything. So you mentioned about this, some challenges, and I think my feeling is that many Canadians, they don't know about not even business history, but just Canadian history, pre-settlement history. And don't you think those challenges sometimes is caused just by the lack of knowledge? Maybe in schools, the school programs have to be revised and to teach the real history of Canada.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's only been recently where there is more educational opportunities right from young kids, right? So and when you look at the challenges that exist, and when you see kids raised in families without a lot of awareness, then these kids aren't really they don't understand the Indigenous situation. They don't understand the Indigenous context in Canada until they start learning about it when they're in high school or when they're in university, and by then sometimes there's already a thinking that's entrenched, right? So it's a little bit harder. If you actually are able to teach kids the real history right from a very early age, you're going to grow up with a much better understanding with the ability to have more of an open heart and being able to work together very well. So unfortunately, the educational system in Canada really, really failed in many, many ways, all of Canada, for so long, and it's somewhat changing, but I don't know if it's changing as fast as it needs to.
Yeah. So one of those many things that we don't know, I mean, average Canadian doesn't know, that is about hereditary chiefs. Just during the last protest against the pipelines, many Canadians, again, I know from my experience that because people know that I work at First Nations University. Some people ask me, so what that means, because they know that the First Nations communities, they have a chief, and but they also have a hereditary chiefs. Maybe as an Indigenous person, can you talk about this institution and what's the role of hereditary chiefs in governing the communities?
So, the hereditary chiefs are not as prevalent in this part of the country as they are, for example, in BC. But when the hereditary chiefs, when you're a young kid, you understand that someday you're going to be a leader, and you grow up with that understanding, and you grow up within the home of community leaders. You're in, so you have a sense of responsibility, a sense of leadership that's just inherent. It's part of who you are. So to me, when you get these hereditary leaders are people that have been acculturated, accustomed. They are educated right from a very young age about what responsibility is and what leadership is. So when they assume control, when they assume power, when they assume the role, they have I believe, a much better background experience than somebody who for example, can just throw their name in a ballot box and get elected, right? So the nature of those, the responsibility is ingrained in them. So they have to have, that's just my understanding, my limited understanding of those roles. But I believe that that's one of the main benefits of having a leadership role like that.
Yeah, a little bit maybe about outside of Canada. Some years ago, I had a student in my class. He was 60 plus years old, and he was a headman. I don't have his permission, that's why I don't want to name. He was, maybe the most responsible student I ever had in my class. I mean, hey, come on, it's when you are 65, it's not too easy to, last time he took the math classes 40 years ago. He was driving every once a week, about 100 kilometers, even more. And he never was late. And I mean, just that he was a phenomenal person. He had some relatives in United States, and he was traveling, visiting his relatives. He said that, I kind of like, I complain about, I have many complaints about our, system, and if in Canada, how does Canadian government treat Indigenous people? But we have better governance than in United States. I mean, Indigenous governance. You got your PhD degree in Australia, and I know I kind of communicated with Indigenous people from Africa, but mostly regarding the Indigenous science. That was my contact. But I mean, because it's not my area, I never talked about the governance. Do you know what is the difference between Indigenous governance systems in different countries?
I think that I've been to Indigenous communities in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and there's so much similarities, right? So then some of the traditions that when you smudge in Canada, you find a very similar activity in Australian Indigenous communities. So there's many similarities in our worldview. Some of the values that are the challenge is, the difference is really about the countries and the laws that they all of us live in, right? So we're constrained, and we by the rules that exist within each one of our nations. So certainly there's going to be a lot of variation in how communities govern themselves and how they pursue economic opportunity, and I think that in more ways than we are similar in more ways in terms of our social and our cultural traditional, but on the governance side of the world and on the economic side of the world, that's where all those differences exist. Probably because of the nature of the laws that have been created, the nature of the history in those countries.
Um, I know you don't have too much time. My last question, it will be about future. So we talked about past, about present, but a little bit about future, and mostly about the education maybe. You know that because of this pandemic, we all teaching online. And to be honest, at the beginning, I had some concern that students wouldn't like this format and would complain. But surprisingly, I'm very glad to see that lots of good comments and good feedback. And I remember one of my discussions in one of the conferences with one young Indigenous lady. We were talking about mathematics, teaching mathematics in Indigenous communities. And that lady told me that it's a very interesting point. She said, you know, we are oral nations.
Yeah.
We like when it's like even algebra. She said that I like when someone explains me algebra, not just by writing, but in oral format. And what I notice now, students ask me the question just by email. At the beginning, I was just writing the answer and in PDF format, and I was posting on the website. But then I realized that I can do the same by video, right? So I can explain, and I can use my tablet as a whiteboard. I can write it, and I explain, I post it. And I see that it's better. It works better, much better than when you just post the PDFs. And students like that more. It looks like we're coming, we are forced to go this way, but we're coming back to that Indigenous way of teaching. So what do you think, again, about the future? Do you think we have to use more elements of Indigenous teaching?
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, I think that not only in Indigenous teaching, I think that you know, we're finding more and more that that the values around you know, material gain, material wealth are not too you know, they're detrimental to the health and well-being of our planet, right? So they're detrimental to the health and well-being of many people within our societies, because there's so much inequity, right? So I think that Indigenous values of, you know, reciprocity, of sharing, of actually you know, having a relationship with the world, everything in the world around us, be it rocks or people, right? Having respect and honoring those because of the spirit that are imbued in each one of those entities. And I think that those values that we so long have sustained our societies as Indigenous people are going to be hopefully more realized as being essential to the longevity and sustainability of our whole planet.
Yeah, it's. I want to finish with this optimistic perspective. Thank you very much again for your time. I wish good luck to all of us this semester, and I hope this pandemic will end soon. But I hope we will take all good things that you learned during this pandemic for future.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.